Well, we got another snow day, and I want to give you a little bit of what we would have talked about in class today to go along with your reading so we don't get any further behind. This is the flipped class lecture that will look at opponents of the New Deal and isolationism in the 1930s. With the snow days, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem because the test will still be on May 6th and we have to get through everything. At the end of this slideshow, I have a little bit of a schedule, an adjusted schedule, to help you understand what we're going to be covering and how we're going to try to get back on track with our calendar. I can tell you, mark it on your calendar, we are shooting to take the Period 7 Part 2 test on Monday, February 22nd, a week from today. So we've got to get through World War II this week, and we'll talk about how we're going to do that when I see you in class tomorrow. So a little bit about where we're at now. When we left, we were talking about the Dust Bowl, and I showed you some incredible images of the Dust Bowl. We talked about the plight of farmers in the plains areas, and I wanted to mention briefly the biggest program from the Second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration. This WPA program is so big that often when people would talk about the Depression era projects, everything sort of got labeled as a WPA project, whether it was done by the WPA or not. The reason for that is the WPA was so big. It's sort of like the way Kleenex is a brand name, but it's also what people generically call a tissue when they're looking for a tissue. So the WPA is sort of the generic New Deal program that did so much that people just often remember anything from the 1930s, any kind of works project from the 1930s, as being a WPA project. The WPA did construction projects like the CWA and the PWA. They built parks and post offices and schools, but they also did more. They spent $11 billion to give jobs to over 8 million workers, and they didn't just hire workers to rake leaves in parks and build bridges. They hired people to do what they were good at. They hired professionals. They hired photographers to take photographs and record life during the Great Depression. They hired archaeologists to dig at archaeological sites. They hired artists to paint murals, and they hired playwrights to write plays, and they hired historians to do history. And some of the examples around Evansville, Angel Mounds was dug during the Great Depression under the direction of Glenn Black from IU, and it was a WPA project. Slave narratives were collected where historians went out and interviewed living former slaves, and they recorded their stories, and these stories would have been lost if not for this project, because unfortunately black history in the 1930s didn't really matter that much outside of the black community, and it was the WPA and the Slave Narratives Project that recorded those for us to go back and look at today. Also photography, photographs were taken, photographers were paid to record life during the Great Depression, and some of the most famous pictures of the Great Depression were done by government photographers. Also, artists were paid to paint murals in post offices and schools, and also posters. Lots of Great Depression era art comes out of the WPA. Other things from the Second New Deal, the probably one of the most significant pieces of legislation was the Wagner Act, which strengthened the labor movement, and the government is getting on the side of workers. You know, prior to this, often the government would come in and it would be on the side of the factory owners, but the Wagner Act is going to guarantee the right of the workers to collectively bargain. We're going to see workers being more organized and a little more assertive, and we're going to see the birth of these sit-down strikes at the General Motors plant, where workers just go in and occupy the factory and sit down and don't work as a sign of protest. Now, the heart of what we would talk about today in class is our opponents to the New Deal. Now, Not everybody liked what Roosevelt was doing. He was elected president 4 times. He had significant support of the American people, but he had very vocal critics. People said the New Deal was not getting the country out of the Depression. They said that the government was getting too big, too strong, and infringing on people's liberties on one side, and then on the other side, opponents said Roosevelt wasn't doing enough. The New Deal was not helping regular people enough. It helped businesses and banks too much. It didn't reform or remake our system. It sort of reinforced the status quo. So Roosevelt gets criticism from people on both sides. People like the Liberty League, who said he's doing too much, and then opponents like Father Coughlin and Dr. Townsend and Huey Long, who say he's not doing enough. And I always say that if a president is getting criticized from people on both sides, he's probably doing good work, because you can't please all of the people all of the time, and if you're criticized from both the left and the right, you're probably somewhere in the middle and doing a decent job. First, the opponents on the right who said he was doing too much. The American Liberty League is the group that says Roosevelt has gone too far. This is made up mostly by wealthy Republicans and conservative Democrats, including Al Smith, who ran for president, the Catholic New Yorker who ran for president in 1928 against Herbert Hoover. The Liberty League is going to see what Roosevelt is doing as a form of socialism, and they're gonna defend business interests. They want to work to weaken the labor unions. They really go after Roosevelt and say that he is distorting what America is all about, and that capitalism and the free market system is really under attack. They're really going to go after FDR in 1936, and they're not going to win. But they will be vocal critics on the right. Now, some vocal critics on the left include Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest from Detroit, and he initially supported the New Deal, but then began to criticize it because he said it didn't go far enough. Father Coughlin had a large radio audience. He was sort of like the political talk radio king of his day. If you think of a Rush Limbaugh type, only on the other side, that would be Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin wanted FDR to do more, especially with banks. He wanted to nationalize the banks, and he was very anti-Semitic. He linked, bankers and Jews together. He didn't like Jews. He would call the New Deal the Jew deal at times, and he became more and more fascist and anti-Semitic, and the Catholic Church would eventually pull the plug on his radio program. Another opponent to the left was Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Townsend wanted to take care of the old people, elderly people who couldn't take care of themselves. There was no safety net. There was no Social Security, so you worked until as long as you could, and then hopefully you had some money to retire. Hopefully your kids or family would take care of you in your later years when you couldn't take care of yourself. And Dr. Townsend advocated giving each senior a monthly check, and then to make sure that money went back into the economy, the stipulation was that money had to be spent every month. Townsend saw this as a win-win. We take care of old people, we help old people out, and we also force them to put that money back into the economy, so we pump money back into the economy. This was going to be funded by a national sales tax. And I guess the most direct result of Townsend's plan, or the thing that most closely looks like what Townsend was calling for, is Social Security. It's not exactly what Townsend was calling for. Social Security will be paid for by taxes on income, and it will be workers will pay into an account, and then when you retire you take money out of that account. But this idea of providing support for the elderly is really what Townsend is calling for, and then later what the Social Security Act and Social Security will do. And then there's Huey Long, the most well-remembered of Roosevelt's critics, maybe the most dangerous of Roosevelt's critics, the most successful of Roosevelt's critics. His plan was the Share Our Wealth plan, and he wanted to give every family at least $5,000. He was going to share our wealth, or take money from the rich and take care of the poor. He was Robin Hood. He was going to steal from the rich and give to the poor. His logic was that nobody needs over $1 million, and that we need to have a guaranteed base standard of living, of a house, and you know, a little bit of income. And this was very popular amongst people who were really poor. He had the Share Our Wealth clubs all over the country, and he had come to dominate politics in Louisiana. He did this through, you know, giving people stuff, creating jobs through public works programs, building roads, paving roads, building bridges, building LSU, building a new state capitol. Spent tons of money in Louisiana. He also crushed his enemies, was not above intimidation. There are all kinds of stories of people being bought off or crushed if they tried to oppose Huey Long. He was the senator. He was governor of Louisiana, and then because he couldn't run for governor again, he ran for U.S. Senate. He was the senator from Louisiana and still controlled the political machine in Louisiana while he was in Washington, D.C., and he planned to challenge FDR in '36. And he was scary. And he was assassinated in 1935 by the nephew of one of those political opponents that he had crushed, a young doctor, and I think Weiss was his last name, and he shot Huey Long when Huey Long was leaving the state house in Louisiana. He had been back in town to make sure that some of his legislation got pushed through, walked out, and Weiss shot him and killed him. So that eliminated one of the most dangerous opponents to FDR. During the late 1930s, these are some of the other things that are associated with the Second New Deal. Most notably, the Social Security Act of '35, the old age pension for elderly people, unemployment compensation, and welfare payments. The other thing that we would talk about if we were in school today is isolationism at this time. While we're dealing with the Great Depression, other countries around the world are dealing with the Depression too, and there is trouble in Europe. Hitler is coming to power in Nazi Germany. Other dictators are coming to power in places like Spain and Italy. There's lots of unrest. There's lots of instability. There's a growing tension in Europe, and there's a growing tension in the Pacific as well, as Japan is making aggressive moves in Manchuria and threatening imperial holdings there. And we choose to look the other way. After World War I, we're really gun shy of getting involved in European affairs. We feel like we got duped into joining World War I, and over 100,000 American lives were lost, which is small compared to the number of lives lost of European nations, but still, we don't want to get sucked into their trouble again. So we're going to be very isolationist. So in the late 1930s, as bad stuff is happening, we choose to look the other way. Congress will actually, to try to prevent us from being sucked into a European war like we were in 1917, Congress is going to pass some neutrality laws that keep us from interfering or being entangled in European affairs. In 1935, they pass a law that limits our arms sales to all belligerents, all people fighting, whether they're enemies or friends. We are going to be neutral, and we're not going to do business with countries at war. We also discourage people from traveling to these countries. Remembering what happened with the Lusitania and some of the other ships that the Germans sunk, the American Congress is going to tell Americans, if you travel on a ship that is owned by somebody that's at war, you do so at your own risk. And we're also going to follow William Jennings Bryan's advice and not allow banks to loan money or extend credit to nations at war. And that comes in 1937. So we are really trying to isolate ourselves from what's going on, especially in Europe, and keep our business interests out of it. This is going to cause a real problem for Roosevelt, because Roosevelt, before most Americans, is going to see that what Hitler and Mussolini are doing in Europe is really dangerous, and that we need to stand with Great Britain to block their advances. World War II is going to break out when Germany invades Poland. That's going to be years before we get involved, and we will only finally get involved in the war fully when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. So from 1939, September of 1939 to December of 1941, Roosevelt is hoping that we can do something to help our friends, or the countries that we are in agreement with, and also navigate the waters, that the political waters that want to keep America as far away from the war in Europe as possible. We're going to be talking about this more as we get into chapter 23, and I would strongly encourage you to watch the crash course video that I have posted on the web page for part 1 of World War II. The beginning of that video talks a lot about how we go from being very isolationistic to kind of isolationistic, and how President Roosevelt works within the framework that Congress gives him to support England prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now tomorrow we are going, if you follow the calendar, if you've got it printed out or if you pull it up, tomorrow we will be covering what we would have covered on Monday, February 8th. That's the beginning of chapter 23. That's pages 692 to 699. And we are going to try to condense World War II a little bit, make up a day here, and then test on period 7, part 2, on Monday, February 22nd. So we'll be trying to cram some things in. I've got another video like this that's 18 minutes that covers the women in World War II and Japanese internment during World War II that I'll post up that you can look at. So if you want to read ahead, you can go ahead and start reading ahead through chapter 23, because we're going to try to get through chapter 23 this week, and then test over period 7 part 2, which is basically the Great Depression and World War II, next Monday. So that's it. Watch the John Green videos. Have a good President's Day, and I will see you tomorrow.